It was a crisp autumn morning in the quiet town of Maplewood, where the leaves painted the streets in hues of gold and amber. Alex, a retired schoolteacher, stood on his back porch sipping coffee from his favorite mug, a ceramic keepsake his late wife had painted years ago. His yard was his sanctuary, a peaceful patch of green where he spent hours nurturing roses, hydrangeas, and a small vegetable garden. He loved every inch of it, not just for its beauty but for the memories it held. Every flower bed had been planted with care, every stone path laid with a purpose. It was a testament to decades of hard work and devotion. That morning, something seemed off. As Alex gazed across his yard, a faint unease crept into his mind. The border that separated his property from his neighbor Greg's was marked by a row of shrubs, neatly trimmed and always maintained by Alex himself. But today, they appeared to be farther away, as if the boundary of his yard had shifted overnight. He dismissed the thought at first, thinking perhaps it was just his imagination or a trick of the morning light. But curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to take a closer look. As Alex walked toward the shrubs, the feeling of unease grew stronger. He noticed that a section of the hedges appeared to have been freshly dug up and replanted, the soil still loose and the plants not quite aligned with the others. His heart sank as he crouched down and inspected the ground. The boundary markers, small metal stakes driven into the earth to mark the property lines, were nowhere to be found. Instead, there were fresh indentations in the soil where the stakes had been removed. Alex's mind raced. Could Greg, his neighbor, have moved the stakes? It seemed absurd at first. Greg had always been an aloof figure, keeping to himself and rarely engaging with the neighborhood. They weren't close, but Alex had no reason to suspect malice. Still, the evidence was hard to ignore. Feeling a mixture of disbelief and anger, Alex decided to check his records. He went inside, pulled out the folder containing his property deed and survey documents, and studied the layout of his land. According to the official map, the boundary was supposed to run parallel to the hedges, right where the stakes had been originally placed. The realization hit Alex like a punch to the gut. Greg had deliberately moved the markers to expand his yard into Alex's property. It wasn't just a small encroachment, either. Greg had claimed a good 3 feet of Alex's yard, a strip that included part of his vegetable garden and one of the flower beds his wife had loved. The audacity of it left Alex stunned. For the rest of the day, Alex couldn't focus on anything else. He replayed every interaction he'd ever had with Greg, searching for clues he might have missed. Greg had moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago, buying the property next door after its previous owners retired to Florida. From the start, Greg had been something of an enigma. He kept odd hours, rarely attended community events, and had a knack for avoiding small talk. Occasionally, Alex had noticed Greg making small adjustments to his property, installing a taller fence, trimming back branches that overhung his yard, but he'd chalked it up to personal preference. Now, those small acts seemed like part of a larger pattern. That evening, Alex decided to confront Greg. He rehearsed what he would say, keeping his tone calm and measured. He didn't want to start a feud, he just wanted to get to the bottom of things. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Alex walked over to Greg's house and rang the doorbell. It took a while for Greg to answer, and when he finally did, he looked surprised to see Alex standing there. "Evening, Alex," Greg said, leaning against the doorframe. His casual demeanor only added to Alex's irritation. "Evening, Greg," Alex replied. "I noticed something odd in my yard today. It seems like the boundary markers have been moved. Do you know anything about that?" Greg's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, discomfort, maybe, or guilt. "Can't say I do," he said smoothly. "Maybe they got shifted in the wind or something." Alex raised an eyebrow. "The wind doesn't pull stakes out of the ground and replant hedges, Greg." Greg shrugged, his nonchalant attitude grating on Alex's nerves. "Look, I don't know what to tell you. I haven't touched anything. Alex's patience was wearing thin. I have the survey documents, Greg. I know exactly where the boundary is supposed to be, and it's not where those hedges are now. For a moment, Greg said nothing. Then, he crossed his arms and smirked. Well, if you're so sure, why don't you get it surveyed again? Until then, I suggest you stop making accusations. Alex left without another word, his blood boiling. The audacity of Greg's response left him reeling. It wasn't just the denial, it was the smugness, the complete lack of respect. That night, Alex lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what to do. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he couldn't let Greg get away with stealing part of his yard. Over the next few days, Alex began to gather evidence. He took photos of the displaced hedges and the area where the stakes had been removed. He reached out to a local land surveyor to confirm the exact boundaries of his property. The surveyor's findings were clear: Greg had encroached on Alex's land, and the stakes had been moved several feet into Alex's property. Armed with this information, Alex decided to take the next step. He filed a formal complaint with the local zoning board, providing the surveyor's report and the photographs as evidence. At the same time, he began speaking with other neighbors, asking if they'd noticed anything unusual about Greg's behavior. To his surprise, several of them shared similar stories. Greg had a history of pushing boundaries, literally and figuratively. One neighbor mentioned that Greg had once trimmed a tree on their property without permission, while another recalled him extending his driveway onto communal land. As word spread, the neighborhood began to rally around Alex. They saw his fight as a stand against a bully who had taken advantage of their trust for too long. With their support, Alex felt more determined than ever to see justice done. But Greg wasn't going to give up easily. When he received notice of the zoning board's investigation, he doubled down on his claims, hiring a lawyer and attempting to argue that the new boundary lines were legitimate. The battle was shaping up to be more contentious than Alex had anticipated, but he refused to back down. This wasn't just about a few feet of land, it was about standing up for what was right. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the quiet town of Maplewood to its core. Little did Alex know, the twists and turns of this saga were far from over. The days following Alex's initial confrontation with Greg were marked by an unusual quiet in the neighborhood, almost as if everyone was holding their breath. Alex, however, was anything but calm. Though his demeanor remained outwardly composed, his mind was a whirlwind of frustration and determination. Greg's dismissive attitude and outright lies gnawed at him, making every glance toward his encroached yard a painful reminder of the neighbor's audacity. Alex's home office became a makeshift war room. Maps, photographs, and legal documents were spread across his desk, the usually tidy space now a chaotic representation of his thoughts. He began sifting through old property records, zoning laws, and anything else that might provide leverage in his dispute with Greg. His mornings, once spent leisurely tending to his garden, were now consumed with research and planning. The neighborhood was slowly catching wind of the brewing conflict. Maplewood was a close-knit community, and news spread quickly through casual conversations over fences and during morning dog walks. Neighbors began stopping by Alex's house to offer their support or share their own grievances about Greg. It turned out Greg wasn't just an opportunist, he was a serial boundary pusher. There were stories of him encroaching on another neighbor's flower bed, cutting down a shared tree without consent, and even parking his car partially on someone else's driveway. Each account painted a clearer picture of Greg as a man who thrived on exploiting the goodwill of others. One story in particular stood out to Alex. His neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, a widow in her 70s, confided in him about an incident that had happened shortly after Greg moved in. She had noticed him building a shed dangerously close to her property line. When she confronted him, he had brushed her off with a charming smile and a promise to double-check the measurements. The shed remained where it was, and Mrs. Caldwell, feeling intimidated, had let the matter drop. Her story filled Alex with a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that standing up to Greg wasn't just about reclaiming his yard, it was about sending a message that such behavior wouldn't be tolerated. As Alex delved deeper into the legal side of things, he began to realize just how tricky property disputes could be. The laws were often murky, and proving intentional encroachment required solid evidence. Fortunately, Alex had already taken steps to strengthen his case. The surveyor's report was a crucial piece of evidence, and the photos he'd taken of the freshly dug soil and displaced hedges provided a visual timeline of Greg's actions. But Alex knew he needed more. He began keeping a detailed journal, recording everything he observed about Greg's behavior. He also set up a small, motion-activated camera near the disputed boundary, hidden among the hedges. It was a risky move, but Alex hoped it would capture anything that might further support his claims. Meanwhile, Greg seemed unfazed by the growing tension. He went about his business as if nothing was amiss, occasionally glancing toward Alex's yard with a smirk that made Alex's blood boil. It was as if Greg believed he was untouchable, confident that his casual charm and deflection tactics would shield him from any real consequences. That arrogance only fueled Alex's resolve. He wasn't just fighting for his yard, he was fighting for every neighbor who had ever been bullied into silence by Greg's tactics. The tipping point came one evening when Alex overheard Greg talking loudly on his phone in his backyard. Greg was bragging about his plans to sell his property, mentioning how the expanded yard was a major selling point. Alex's heart raced as he listened, anger and disbelief coursing through him. This wasn't just a matter of encroachment, it was outright fraud. Greg was attempting to inflate the value of his property by stealing land that wasn't his. Armed with this new information, Alex began strategizing. He realized that exposing Greg's actions publicly could be the most effective way to hold him accountable. The upcoming monthly community meeting presented the perfect opportunity. The meetings were attended by nearly every resident in Maplewood, as well as representatives from the local zoning board. Alex knew that if he could present his case in front of an audience, Greg's actions would be impossible to ignore. In the days leading up to the meeting, Alex worked tirelessly to prepare his presentation. He created a visual timeline using the photos he had taken, overlaid with the surveyor's findings. He included testimonies from neighbors who had experienced similar issues with Greg, crafting a narrative that highlighted the pattern of behavior. Alex also reached out to a local attorney for advice, ensuring that his arguments were grounded in legal precedent. When the night of the meeting arrived, Alex felt a mixture of nerves and determination. The community center was packed, the room buzzing with chatter as neighbors caught up on the latest gossip. Greg was there too, leaning casually against the wall with his usual air of smug confidence. Alex took a deep breath, clutching the folder of evidence he had compiled. This was his chance to set things right, not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood. As the meeting began, Alex waited patiently for his turn to speak. When his name was called, he stood and walked to the front of the room, his heart pounding. He began by recounting the events that had unfolded over the past few weeks, starting with his discovery of the displaced boundary markers. As he spoke, he displayed the photos on a projector screen, guiding the audience through the evidence step by step. He explained the surveyor's findings, emphasizing the deliberate nature of Greg's actions. The room grew increasingly silent as Alex presented his case. Neighbors exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. When Alex played a snippet of the audio he had recorded of Greg bragging about the expanded yard, the tension in the room was palpable. Greg's confident demeanor faltered for the first time, a flicker of unease crossing his face. But Alex wasn't done. He called on several neighbors to share their experiences with Greg, creating a chorus of voices that underscored the pattern of manipulation and deceit. By the time Alex finished, the room was buzzing with outrage. Even the zoning board representatives appeared visibly unsettled, whispering to one another as they reviewed the evidence. Greg attempted to defend himself, his voice dripping with feigned innocence. He claimed that the boundary markers must have been moved by mistake and accused Alex of blowing the situation out of proportion. But his arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The community had seen enough. One by one, neighbors began speaking out, demanding accountability and expressing their support for Alex. By the end of the meeting, the zoning board representatives announced that they would launch a formal investigation into the matter. Greg's expression darkened as he realized the gravity of the situation. The tables had turned, and his once unshakable confidence had been replaced by a growing sense of dread. For Alex, the meeting was a turning point. It wasn't just about reclaiming his yard, it was about reclaiming the integrity of the community. As he walked home that night, surrounded by neighbors who patted him on the back and offered words of encouragement, he felt a renewed sense of hope. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Alex felt like he wasn't fighting it alone. In the weeks following the community meeting, the air in Maplewood grew tense, crackling with the quiet electricity of a town divided. Though most neighbors supported Alex, a handful remained wary of the brewing conflict. Property disputes were notoriously messy, and some feared the fallout might drag the entire neighborhood into an uncomfortable spotlight. Greg, meanwhile, retreated into a kind of sullen defiance. His once casual arrogance had given way to a brooding silence, though he occasionally threw pointed glares in Alex's direction whenever they crossed paths. Alex, however, was undeterred. The support he had received at the meeting had invigorated him, but he knew the real battle was just beginning. The zoning board's investigation was underway, and while he felt confident in the evidence he had presented, Alex also understood that the process could take weeks or even months. He needed to stay vigilant, both to ensure that Greg didn't try anything further and to protect himself from any retaliatory actions. It didn't take long for Greg to make his next move. One morning, Alex woke to find an official-looking letter slipped under his door. The return address belonged to a law firm based in the nearby city. The letter accused Alex of defamation, claiming that his public accusations at the community meeting had caused Greg emotional distress and damage to his reputation. The letter demanded a written apology and threatened legal action if Alex didn't comply. Alex read the letter twice, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with frustration. He could see through Greg's tactics for what they were, an attempt to intimidate him into silence. Rather than panic, Alex took the letter to the attorney he had consulted earlier. The attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Clara, skimmed the letter and snorted. "This is a classic scare tactic," she said, leaning back in her chair. "They don't have a leg to stand on. You've presented facts, not baseless accusations, and the evidence backs you up. If anything, this letter is an act of desperation." Clara advised Alex to ignore the letter for now, focusing instead on building a rock-solid case for the zoning board's investigation. But Alex wasn't content to sit back and wait. He decided to dig deeper into Greg's history, hoping to uncover anything that might further bolster his case. With Clara's help, he filed a request for public records related to Greg's property. What he found was both surprising and infuriating. Several years before moving to Maplewood, Greg had been involved in a similar dispute in another town. The records detailed a lawsuit in which Greg had been accused of encroaching on a neighbor's property by altering boundary markers and constructing a fence that extended into their yard. The case had been settled out of court, with Greg agreeing to pay damages and remove the fence. Though the details were sparse, the pattern was undeniable. Greg's behavior in Maplewood wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a larger history of manipulation and deceit. Armed with this new information, Alex shared the discovery with Clara, who agreed it could be a game-changer. Together, they prepared a detailed report for the zoning board, highlighting Greg's past actions and drawing parallels to the current dispute. Clara also suggested reaching out to the neighbors involved in Greg's previous case, hoping they might be willing to provide testimony or additional evidence. Alex hesitated, tracking down strangers to ask for their help felt invasive, but Clara assured him it was worth pursuing. Meanwhile, the tension between Alex and Greg continued to escalate. Greg, seemingly emboldened by his lawyer's involvement, began making subtle but deliberate moves to antagonize Alex. He started hosting loud parties late into the night, his guests' cars often blocking Alex's driveway. He let his dog roam freely, allowing it to dig up parts of Alex's yard. On one occasion, Alex caught Greg standing on the disputed section of the yard, staring at him with a smirk that spoke volumes. Alex felt his blood boil but forced himself to stay calm. He knew Greg was trying to provoke him into reacting, and he refused to take the bait. The tipping point came one rainy afternoon when Alex returned home to find a group of workers dismantling the fence that separated his property from Greg's. Panic surged through him as he rushed over, demanding to know what was going on. The workers, clearly uncomfortable, explained that Greg had hired them to redefine the property line and install a new fence several feet deeper into Alex's yard. Alex immediately called the zoning board and Clara, his voice shaking with anger as he recounted what was happening. Clara advised him to document everything and insisted that they would file an emergency injunction to halt the construction. Alex spent the next hour in the rain, taking photos and videos of the workers and the encroachment. His neighbors, hearing the commotion, began to gather, their expressions a mix of disbelief and outrage. Greg, watching from his porch, refused to come down, shouting instead that he was within his rights and that Alex should get used to it. By the time the workers left, the damage was done. The old fence lay in a heap, and the new posts had already been set in concrete. Alex felt a crushing sense of defeat as he stared at the mess. For the first time, he wondered if this fight was worth it. Greg's relentless audacity seemed impossible to counter, and the legal system moved too slowly to provide immediate relief. But then, as Alex looked around at the faces of his neighbors, he saw something that reignited his determination: solidarity. Mrs. Caldwell, the elderly widow who had once been intimidated into silence, stepped forward and placed a hand on Alex's arm. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. "We've all had enough of him, and we're with you." The other neighbors nodded in agreement, murmuring their support. It was a small moment, but it reminded Alex why he had started this fight in the first place. The following week, Clara secured the injunction, forcing Greg to halt construction on the new fence. The zoning board also expedited their investigation, spurred by the mounting evidence and growing community pressure. Meanwhile, Alex continued to gather support from his neighbors, many of whom signed a petition urging the board to take decisive action against Greg. Then came the first unexpected twist. Clara managed to track down one of the neighbors from Greg's previous dispute, a man named Richard who still harbored a grudge over the incident. Richard was more than willing to share his story, and his testimony painted an even clearer picture of Greg's pattern of behavior. But what really caught Clara's attention was a detail Richard mentioned in passing: Greg had a habit of keeping meticulous records of his property dealings, including receipts, contracts, and even handwritten notes about his plans. If such records existed, they could potentially prove that Greg's actions in Maplewood were premeditated. Clara suggested that Alex file a subpoena for Greg's property records as part of the zoning board's investigation. Though it was a long shot, Alex agreed, hoping it might yield something useful. To everyone's surprise, the subpoena revealed a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Among Greg's records was a notebook containing detailed sketches and notes about the property line adjustments he had made, complete with measurements and calculations. The notebook even included references to the increased value of his property due to the expanded yard. It was a smoking gun that left no doubt about Greg's intentions. When the zoning board reviewed the evidence, their decision was swift and decisive. Greg was ordered to restore the original boundary markers, remove the partially constructed fence, and pay a substantial fine for his actions. Additionally, his attempts to sell the property were put on hold until the matter was fully resolved. For Alex, the victory was bittersweet. The fight had taken a toll on him, both emotionally and physically, but the outcome was worth it. His yard was restored, and Greg's reign of manipulation had come to an end. The community, galvanized by Alex's perseverance, felt stronger and more united than ever. Even Mrs. Caldwell found the courage to stand up for herself, insisting on repairs to her property that Greg had previously ignored. Greg, unable to face the consequences of his actions, quietly put his house on the market and left Maplewood within months. As the moving truck pulled away, Alex stood in his yard, gazing at the restored boundary line. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for the entire neighborhood. Though the fight had been exhausting, Alex felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had learned that standing up to injustice wasn't just about reclaiming what was lost, it was about protecting what mattered most. As the sun set over Maplewood, casting a warm glow across his garden, Alex felt a deep sense of peace. The battle was over, but the lessons it had taught him would last a lifetime. The days following Greg's abrupt departure from Maplewood were marked by an almost eerie silence, as though the neighborhood itself were exhaling after years of tension. For Alex, the absence of Greg's overbearing presence was both a relief and an adjustment. He no longer felt the daily sting of seeing his garden invaded or his property disrespected, but the scars of the long battle remained. His yard, though restored, still bore the physical and emotional remnants of the conflict, the disrupted flower beds, the faint outlines of the hastily dismantled fence, and the lingering memories of sleepless nights spent strategizing. Life, however, has a way of moving forward, and so did Alex. In the weeks that followed, he poured his energy back into his garden, determined to revive the beauty that Greg's encroachment had disrupted. The community rallied around him, offering assistance and supplies. Mrs. Caldwell gifted him a tray of heirloom tulip bulbs she'd been saving for a special occasion. Another neighbor, a carpenter by trade, volunteered to rebuild Alex's fence free of charge. The acts of kindness filled Alex with gratitude, reminding him of the resilience and strength that lay at the heart of their neighborhood. But as Alex returned to his routine, he couldn't shake the feeling that Greg's departure hadn't fully closed the chapter. Something about the entire ordeal nagged at him, a sense that there was more to uncover. Despite Greg's silence during the investigation, his departure had felt too sudden, too clean. Alex began to wonder if there was another layer to the story that hadn't been revealed. One afternoon, while sorting through the evidence he'd gathered for the zoning board, Alex stumbled upon an old map of the neighborhood. It was a hand-drawn sketch he'd found during his research, predating the modern surveys. The map showed the original plots of land, including easements and communal spaces that had since been absorbed into private properties. Alex noticed something odd: a narrow strip of land, marked as public access, ran parallel to the boundary line Greg had attempted to manipulate. It wasn't part of Alex's property, nor Greg's, it was a shared pathway that had seemingly been forgotten over the years. Intrigued, Alex began digging deeper into the history of the strip. He visited the town's archives, poring over old deeds and planning documents. What he discovered left him both surprised and concerned. The strip of land had originally been designated as a firebreak, a precautionary measure in the early days of the town when wooden homes were more susceptible to fire. Over time, as properties were subdivided and sold, the firebreak had been neglected, with homeowners on either side gradually absorbing it into their yards. Greg's actions, Alex realized, hadn't just been about stealing his land, they had also involved encroaching on this forgotten public easement. The implications were significant. If Greg had successfully sold his property with the expanded yard, he would have effectively privatized a piece of land that wasn't his to claim. Alex wondered if this had been part of Greg's larger plan all along. The notebook Greg had left behind contained meticulous notes about property lines, but it also hinted at his knowledge of the easement, with cryptic annotations about shared use and opportunity. Alex decided to bring the matter to the attention of the zoning board, along with the historical records he'd uncovered. The board, intrigued by the new information, agreed to investigate further. Their inquiry revealed that the easement wasn't unique to Alex and Greg's properties. Similar strips existed throughout Maplewood, often forgotten or ignored. The board concluded that the town needed to formally address the status of these firebreaks to prevent future disputes. The revelation sparked a wave of activity in Maplewood. The zoning board began working with the town council to re-establish clear boundaries for the old easements, ensuring they were properly maintained and protected. For Alex, it was a bittersweet moment. While he was glad to see the issue being resolved, he couldn't help but think of how much trouble could have been avoided if the matter had been addressed years earlier. Meanwhile, the community's response to the discovery was mixed. Some residents were supportive, appreciating the importance of preserving communal spaces. Others were less enthusiastic, worried that the changes might affect their property values or require them to give up parts of their yards. Alex found himself at the center of the debate, his role in uncovering the easements making him both a local hero and, in some cases, a target of criticism. Amid the controversy, Alex received an unexpected visitor. It was Richard, the man who had been involved in Greg's previous property dispute. Richard had heard about the easement discovery and decided to pay Alex a visit. Over coffee on Alex's porch, Richard shared more about his experience with Greg. He admitted that while he'd been frustrated by Greg's actions, he'd never pursued the matter as far as Alex had. "You've got guts," Richard said, shaking his head. "Most people would have just let it go, but you didn't. You stood up to him, and now the whole town's paying attention. That's something to be proud of." Alex appreciated the sentiment, but he couldn't help but feel conflicted. The battle with Greg had consumed months of his life, and while he was glad to have reclaimed his yard and exposed Greg's schemes, the process had been exhausting. He wondered if it had all been worth it, especially now that the focus had shifted to the broader issue of the easements. The answer came unexpectedly, during a chance encounter with Mrs. Caldwell. She stopped by one morning, carrying a basket of freshly baked scones. As they sat together in the garden, she shared how the ordeal had inspired her to address some long-standing issues on her own property. With Alex's encouragement, she had confronted a neighbor who had been using her driveway as overflow parking. It was a small victory, but it had given her a newfound sense of confidence. "You showed us that we don't have to let people walk all over us," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice warm with gratitude. "You reminded us that this is our community, and we have a right to protect it." Her words stayed with Alex long after she left. He realized that the fight with Greg had been about more than just a piece of land, it had been about standing up for what was right and setting an example for others. The challenges he had faced, the sleepless nights and endless frustrations, had been worth it if they inspired others to take a stand. As the months passed, the changes in Maplewood became increasingly apparent. The town council implemented new policies to preserve the easements, turning some into green spaces or community gardens. The neighborhood, once fractured by Greg's manipulations, began to heal. Alex's yard, too, flourished once again, his garden blooming with a vibrancy that felt almost symbolic of the community's renewed spirit. One evening, as Alex stood on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on how much had changed. The battle with Greg had been a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire neighborhood. It had brought people together, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths and work toward a stronger, more united community. For Alex, the experience had been transformative. He had rediscovered his own strength and resilience, proving to himself that even in the face of adversity, he could rise to the challenge. And while the fight had been difficult, it had also been a reminder of the power of standing up for what mattered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the garden, Alex felt a deep sense of peace. The chapter with Greg was finally closed, but the lessons it had taught him, and the community, would endure for years to come. As the seasons changed, the story of Alex's battle with Greg became a defining moment in Maplewood's history. People still spoke of it at neighborhood gatherings, referencing it as a pivotal example of standing up against injustice. For Alex, however, life had settled into a quieter rhythm. The once contentious boundary line was now secure, the fence rebuilt sturdier than ever, and his beloved garden thrived once again. Yet, beneath the surface of his newly regained peace, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that the ordeal had left a deeper mark on him than he had initially realized. It wasn't just about the yard anymore. The conflict had awoken something in Alex, a sense of purpose that had been dormant since his retirement. For decades, he had poured his energy into teaching, shaping young minds, and making a difference in his community. Retirement, though peaceful, had left him feeling somewhat adrift. The fight with Greg, despite its challenges, had reignited a spark. Alex began to wonder if there were other ways he could contribute to the betterment of Maplewood and beyond. One day, while tending to his garden, Alex received an unexpected visit. A woman named Diane, who worked for a local news outlet, approached him with a request. She had heard about the property dispute and how Alex's determination had not only restored his yard but also brought attention to the forgotten easements across town. Diane wanted to write a feature story about the ordeal, framing it as a tale of resilience and community action. At first, Alex hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted the spotlight again, especially after everything he had been through. But Diane's enthusiasm was infectious, and she assured him that the story could inspire others facing similar struggles. After some thought, Alex agreed, on the condition that the article would highlight the broader lessons learned, rather than focusing solely on the conflict. The article, titled "A Yard Worth Fighting For: How One Man Sparked a Community Revival," was published in the local paper and quickly gained traction online. It painted a vivid picture of Alex's journey, from the initial discovery of the displaced boundary markers to the triumphant restoration of his property. But more importantly, it emphasized the ripple effects of his actions, the way his fight had prompted the town to address the neglected easements, strengthened bonds among neighbors, and inspired others to stand up for their rights. The response was overwhelming. Alex began receiving letters and emails from people far beyond Maplewood, sharing their own stories of property disputes, community struggles, and personal triumphs. Many expressed gratitude for his courage, while others sought advice on how to handle similar situations. Alex was touched by the outpouring of support and realized that his story had become something much larger than he had ever anticipated. It wasn't long before the article caught the attention of local civic organizations and advocacy groups. One such group, the Community Land Preservation Alliance, invited Alex to speak at a town hall event about his experience. Though public speaking wasn't something Alex had done in years, he agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to shed light on issues that often went unnoticed until they became crises. The town hall was held in a nearby city, in a modest auditorium filled with residents, local officials, and activists. As Alex took the stage, he felt a familiar mix of nerves and determination. He began by recounting his story, emphasizing not just the challenges but also the lessons learned. He spoke about the importance of knowing your rights, documenting evidence, and seeking support from your community. He also touched on the broader implications of his fight, highlighting the need for towns to proactively address issues like forgotten easements and boundary disputes. The audience listened intently, and by the end of Alex's speech, the room erupted into applause. During the Q&A session that followed, people asked thoughtful questions, ranging from legal strategies to ways of fostering stronger community ties. Alex found himself energized by the interaction, realizing that his experience had given him a platform to effect positive change. In the weeks that followed, Alex continued to receive invitations to speak at similar events. He became something of a local advocate for property rights and community accountability, using his story as a springboard to discuss broader issues like urban planning, neighborly respect, and the value of communal spaces. Though he never sought fame, Alex found fulfillment in using his voice to help others navigate challenges of their own. Back in Maplewood, the changes spurred by Alex's fight were becoming increasingly evident. The town council had established a task force to oversee the maintenance of communal easements, ensuring they were properly documented and protected. Some of the old fire breaks were transformed into walking paths or pocket parks, creating new spaces for neighbors to connect. Alex's own yard became a gathering place for the community, a symbol of resilience and renewal. One evening, as Alex sat on his porch, he noticed a young couple walking along the newly established easement that ran parallel to his property. They paused to admire his garden, their laughter carrying on the breeze. It was a simple moment, but it filled Alex with a profound sense of satisfaction. He realized that his fight with Greg, as difficult as it had been, had left a lasting legacy, not just for his yard, but for the entire neighborhood. But the story wasn't quite over. Months later, Alex received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Greg. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar, but the return address indicated that Greg had moved several towns away. Alex hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The letter was brief, written in a tone that was uncharacteristically contrite. In it, Greg admitted to his wrongdoing, acknowledging that his actions had been driven by greed and a sense of entitlement. He apologized for the trouble he had caused and expressed regret for the way he had treated Alex and the other neighbors. Though he didn't provide much detail about his life since leaving Maplewood, Greg hinted that the experience had been a wake-up call, forcing him to reevaluate his priorities. Alex sat with the letter for a long time, processing its contents. Part of him was skeptical. Greg's manipulative tendencies had left a lasting impression, but another part wanted to believe that the apology was genuine. Regardless of Greg's motivations, Alex chose to accept the apology, not because it absolved Greg of his actions, but because it allowed Alex to fully close the chapter and move forward. As time went on, Alex's story became a touchstone for the community, a reminder of the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right. For Alex, the experience had been transformative, reigniting his sense of purpose and showing him the impact one person could have. His yard, once a battleground, now stood as a testament to the strength of community and the enduring value of perseverance. On a warm spring afternoon, as Alex knelt in his garden planting a new row of roses, he reflected on how far he and his neighborhood had come. The fight with Greg had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but it had also brought out the best in him and his community. And in the end, that was what mattered most. As time passed, Alex's story became part of Maplewood's folklore, a tale often shared during neighborhood barbecues and town hall meetings. The garden he had fought so hard to protect was now a flourishing masterpiece, drawing admiration from neighbors and visitors alike. Yet, for Alex, the beauty of his garden was not just in its blooms but in the resilience and unity it symbolized. The ordeal with Greg had fundamentally changed him, leaving him both stronger and more reflective about the role he played in his community. One warm summer morning, Alex received a surprising call from an old friend, Tim, who lived in a neighboring town. Tim, a retired firefighter, had been following Alex's story since it made headlines and now had an intriguing proposition. The council in Tim's town was dealing with its own set of property disputes, particularly over easements similar to the fire breaks Alex had uncovered. Tim suggested that Alex join him in speaking at a town meeting to share his insights and help the community navigate its challenges. Initially hesitant, Alex eventually agreed, feeling that his experience might offer some guidance. He spent the next few days preparing, revisiting the records and notes he had meticulously compiled during his fight with Greg. As he reviewed the events, he was struck by how much he had learned, not just about property laws and boundaries, but about human nature and the strength that could be drawn from standing up for what was right. The town meeting was held in a large community center filled with residents eager for solutions. As Alex and Tim took the stage, Alex couldn't help but feel a pang of nervousness. But as he began to speak, recounting his journey with honesty and humility, the tension melted away. He shared the challenges he had faced, the lessons he had learned, and the unexpected ways the ordeal had brought his community together. By the end of his talk, the room was filled with applause, and several residents approached him with questions and gratitude. One resident, a woman named Clara, told Alex about her ongoing struggle with a developer who was trying to encroach on a communal green space in her neighborhood. She had felt powerless and overwhelmed, but hearing Alex's story had given her the confidence to fight back. Alex listened intently, offering practical advice and encouragement. It was a moment of connection that reminded him why he had agreed to speak in the first place. The meeting sparked something new in Alex. He realized that his experience was not an isolated event but part of a larger issue affecting communities everywhere. Property disputes, forgotten easements, and overreaching neighbors were symptoms of a broader problem, a lack of awareness and accountability that left individuals vulnerable. Alex began to see his story not just as a personal victory but as a call to action, a chance to help others protect what was rightfully theirs. Back in Maplewood, Alex started organizing informal workshops at the local library, inviting neighbors to learn about property rights, conflict resolution, and community building. The workshops quickly grew in popularity, attracting residents from nearby towns as well. Alex, who had once spent his days teaching in a classroom, found himself in a familiar role, sharing knowledge and empowering others. It was fulfilling in a way he hadn't anticipated, a continuation of his life's work in a new and meaningful form. One evening, as Alex was preparing for another workshop, he received an unexpected email. It was from Greg. Unlike the brief and guarded letter Alex had received months earlier, this message was longer and more candid. Greg explained that after leaving Maplewood, he had moved to a smaller town and started working for a property management company. The experience of being held accountable for his actions had forced him to confront some hard truths about himself. Greg admitted that he had spent much of his life taking shortcuts and exploiting others, but losing the battle with Alex had been a turning point. Greg shared that he had recently started volunteering with a local nonprofit that helped mediate property disputes. He credited Alex's perseverance and the community's response with inspiring him to change. While he knew he could never fully make up for his past actions, Greg hoped to use his experiences to prevent others from making the same mistakes. He ended the email by thanking Alex for standing his ground, acknowledging that it had been a wake-up call he hadn't realized he needed. Alex read the email twice, letting Greg's words sink in. He was skeptical at first, wondering if the message was genuine or simply an attempt to ease Greg's conscience. But as he reflected on the journey they had both undergone, Alex felt a sense of closure. Whether or not Greg's transformation was sincere, the fact that his actions had prompted introspection was enough. Alex chose to respond with a short but gracious note, wishing Greg well in his efforts and encouraging him to continue making amends. The email marked a turning point for Alex. For months, he had carried the weight of the conflict with Greg, replaying the events in his mind and wondering if he could have handled things differently. Now, he felt a sense of peace, a release from the lingering resentment and frustration. The experience had been difficult, but it had also been transformative, not just for Alex but for Greg and the entire community. As the years went by, Alex's story continued to inspire others. His workshops evolved into a larger initiative, with guest speakers and resources provided by local organizations. The forgotten easements of Maplewood became well-maintained communal spaces, enjoyed by neighbors young and old. The garden Alex had fought so hard to protect became a centerpiece of the town's annual garden tour, drawing visitors from far and wide. One spring morning, as Alex walked through his garden, he paused to admire the roses in full bloom. The air was filled with the scent of flowers and the sound of birdsong, a reminder of the peace and beauty he had worked so hard to preserve. A young boy from the neighborhood approached him, holding a notebook and pencil. "Mr. Alex," the boy said, his eyes wide with curiosity, "my dad told me about how you saved your garden. Can you teach me how to grow roses like these?" Alex smiled, kneeling down to meet the boy's gaze. "Of course," he said. "The first thing you need to know is that growing a garden takes patience, care, and a little bit of courage. But it's always worth it." As they began planting a new rose bush together, Alex felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The fight with Greg had been about more than just a yard, it had been about protecting something precious, something worth fighting for. And now, as he passed on his knowledge to the next generation, Alex knew that the legacy of his battle would live on, not in the scars of the conflict but in the growth and resilience it had inspired. The garden, like Alex himself, stood as a testament to the power of perseverance, the strength of community, and the enduring beauty of standing up for what's right. And as the roses bloomed, their vibrant colors painting the yard in shades of red, pink, and gold, Alex couldn't help but feel that he had finally come full circle.